You believe that alien races are plausible.
Yeah,
That
Drake equation, it's almost certain that we're not alone, I would
Yep,
say.
I would agree. That technologies which might allow us to bend space or to utilize entanglement in some way suggest that there probably isn't an actual bar to great civilizations separated by what seem to be large distances
Yes, be
making contact with
skeptical,
each
but
other.
we also have to believe. We have to like push this boundary, man. This is our civilization and our survival depends on it.
Sure.
Like,
But despite the fact that you believe those things, it sounds to me like what you've said is you believe that this is more likely a psyop than an actual visitation that we
well, it
are.
wouldn't be the first time that they've done something like this. I mean, you look back to 1988 with UFO TV Live. They had this whole broadcast called with the aviary, it was called, where they brought out all these guys in cloak and dagger and didn't show their faces and had voice mods on them. And of course we know all their names today, and they've been associated with UFO disinformation and stuff like that. One of the guys is actually Owl from the aviary was Hal Puthoff, which is interesting. And Hal Puthoff does have a history with psychological warfare operations. He did that whole stint with the Men at Stare at Goats, with Albert Stubblebean and those guys at the book Sci Spies by Jim Mars. I read all about it. So he's got some interesting history, the stuff he did at SRI International, but he's also got some interesting physics and the whole idea of this polarizable vacuum approach to general relativity, where you can, if you change the permeability and permittivity of free space in between things, you can warp those distances and perhaps those other variables and change the laws of general relativity without violating Einstein, because that's a big no-no in physics. So really interesting stuff that in the literature there, but he don't know if he got that idea on his own, because he worked closely with a lot of other interesting fellows like Bernard Haish from Caltech, who worked as a staff physicist for Lockheed Martin from 1979 to 1999, and did a lot of theoretical work for Lockheed Martin on these theoretical warp drives. Late in mid 1994, I think 1994 is when Miguel Alcubierre published that warp drive paper, and the community kind of just went nuts. So they were like, well, we're gonna have people looking into this, and they did.
All right. So here's the question for you, though. You believe it is possible that we have been or are being visited or will be. You do not buy, as I don't, the evidence that is on the table, because it all seems to have a more rational explanation that is terrestrial. What have you seen that gives you pause, that makes you think, actually, that one might be more easily explained by aliens and their technology visiting the Earth? If there's nothing, there's nothing, but I'd be curious if there's anything.
Well, there's a couple ones you just wonder if they're real or not. So certain things, certain cases. Like there's one video that was supposedly recorded of a UFO flying over, and it instantly prints a crop circle in a field, and it was supposedly captured on like a regular camera, although I haven't seen the chain of evidence or any of the proof for that, because it really just looks like early advanced CGI or something that produces it.
Yeah.
Certain
very hard to accept anything that's just pixels.
I was super into this stuff early on when I first got into it, and I was convinced that it was not like that there might be there was like another cover up, and I took that angle very strongly in a lot of the research that I did, because people like Bob Lazar, who sent me down that rabbit hole, like they're hiding a hangar out in the desert with 9 saucers in it. I mean, come on, that's enough to get anyone young kid interested in in this stuff and the potentials that it might hold. And it's interesting when you start getting into the real physicists that did do work as senior staff physicist for Lockheed Martin, and you're like, wow, Lockheed Martin was looking into inertial, control, and also free energy systems and stuff like that. It's interesting, but it's more interesting, I find, than the fake stuff, which is the whole, there's no proof for any of that. And the element 115 thing is like, it was I could just add numbers to the periodic table and guess element 120 29 129 and say that it has anti-gravity. Where is it? It's been discovered. It's not stable in anything more than a few milliseconds, and it's not anti-gravity yet. So we're still waiting, and the jury's still out. And there's NASA studied field propulsion in 1979 under Alan Holt, and a number of there's a number of other studies that you can look to and say, like, well, they studied this stuff. NASA references UFOs as being an inspiration for why they did the study. So obviously NASA scientists were taking some of this stuff seriously and trying to look into it and do research into it. But I haven't seen direct evidence of anything yet that proves it. And then the physics that we do have that do look promising is things like laser etching, lithography of quantum dots, laser etching quantum dots onto metal surfaces, and then layering these metamaterials that you can create from the laser etchings, and the things that those will do. And then also layered graphene with other types of borafine and other types of interesting two-dimensional materials create some really interesting effects that we'd really like to study more. But again, these things are super expensive to play with, basically.
Well, my understanding is that is changing. Jim Torr's lab seems to have come up with a inexpensive process for mass producing graphene in a useful form. I actually know Jim a little bit, and have nothing but respect for the guy's capacity in the realm of nanotech. It's incredible. So anyway, there's no doubt we are on the verge of many a material revolution where, tiny amounts of matter can be arranged in ways that have extraordinary properties, and presumably any sufficiently advanced race elsewhere in the universe would have encountered those things and leveraged them in all kinds of ways that are hard for us to imagine. So, but I want to go back because you described something fascinating here, which, strengthens my sense about who you are and why I would listen to you on a topic like this. You describe yourself as more credulous with respect to the visitation of Earth by aliens earlier. And the more you've studied and learned, the less you are convinced that the evidence that they have been here exists. You haven't seen anything that compels you. I think that that's a very powerful story for somebody who believes that it is readily possible to have convinced themselves out rather than convinced yourself into the idea that it has happened or is happening. You've gone the other direction, and that's exactly what I would want to see. I would want to see the scientific skepticism cause you to, in fact, realize that there's a more likely explanation for what we have so far seen.
So you want to get into why I got to that position, or the best, and I'll cap it off with the best evidence that I've actually seen so far through my study of trying to prove this out, and over the years.
Yep.
So, yeah, the thing is, it's you get burnout because if you really believe too much in a case, and then you find out, you start digging more and more, and eventually it loses its footing. You debate it with enough skeptics that you realize that you learn more about the case as you debate it with more and more people, and engage more with skeptics. Like, you can't just sit in an echo chamber and with a bunch of people who agree with you. You'll never get really anywhere, and even if you do, what's the point? Because you're just staying inside of a closed hole. So that kind of got me out of that, and I realized pretty early on that technology was the way out of all of this stuff in the science, really proving it out. If you can, do an experiment. If you're saying that you have a technology which can turn steel into dust, then show me and demonstrate it. Build it and then show me how to do it, and how much energy it uses, and all the and everything else. And then we can go from there. Or show me anti-gravity. So we have 70 plus years of the government studying this stuff, and I have a massive archive that we've assembled of all the different studies. But after 2 years of doing APEC, and getting guys like Ronald Evans on from Project Green Glow over in the UK, he was on BBC like a week after he presented on our show, and basically gave like the real deep. This wasn't like the BBC's 10-minute video coverage on it. He presented for an hour and then submitted to an hour Q&A where we just grilled the guy on, asked him anything we wanted about this program that he worked on over at Britain's Area 51, Porton Down. Really interesting stuff, and they're doing some really cool research over there. They have a super sensitive quantum gravitometer. It's called. It measures quantum gravity. Basically just detect any little disturbance. So if UFOs are flying around, it will be able to detect them. But not the first time, again, that what you find is that there's counterintelligence that have seeped in and done things like the aviary that I talked about. One of those guys was a guy named Richard Doty. And there's a documentary I think anyone who gets into UFOs should watch. It's called Mirage Men. And it's the story of this guy named Paul Benowitz, who was an amateur radio operator, and had a bunch of radio equipment too close to an NSA surveillance operation, and something that they were some top secret programs that they were running out of. What's the name of the Air Force base down in New Mexico there? He stumbled upon this and got a little too close to it. And so they assigned this U.S. Air Force OSI, Office of Special Investigations agent, Richard Doty, to the case. And Doty befriended him, and then started planting stuff. They started beaming radio signals into his stuff and made him feel like that he had stumbled across the alien operation, and that it was the NSA talking to aliens, and it was this big thing, and it made the guy go crazy. Actually, Paul Benowitz, the true story, and he actually committed suicide because of all of it. And even after they had thrown him off the trail of it when he was going off the deep end, they had tried. Doty said he had tried to approach him and tell him the truth, and he didn't want to believe it. He was so deep into the rabbit hole at that point, he didn't want to believe that. He wanted to believe that he had stumbled across this big alien thing rather than it was a top secret Air Force project that they were trying to throw him off the case. And then it talks about other operations like Project Plowshare was one where they were doing underground nuclear testing, and then they wanted to monitor some of the radiation effects in the downstream river systems and neighboring towns and cities. And what they were doing to do that is sampling some of the local livestock like cattle, and they were removing the thyroid glands from the cattle because, of course, thyroid has iodine uptake. Uh-huh. So when there's radioactive iodine in the environment from off stream from this nuke test, it's going to get picked up by your thyroid gland, and so that's going to be the place they're going to be able to detect it. And so they were basically, the military was taking people's livestock, cutting out the thyroid glands, and then to throw them off this trail, they were cutting out other organs and dropping them from helicopters and sucking all the blood out and doing all this weird stuff. To throw them off the trail of what they're really after, the thyroid glands for the radioactive iodine, but they were doing all this weird stuff and blaming it on aliens so that they didn't have to pay the farmers for their cattle.
So, question about that. The radioactive iodine has a very short half-life. I think it's 8 days or something like that. So they were doing this in the immediate aftermath of their underground tests?
Yeah. They were testing, and then they were doing the cattle mutilations to blame it on aliens, and because some of the local farmers were getting suspicious and they were trying to throw them off the trail, apparently. So this is like, and then of course you take the other side of this, the play devil's advocate, or conspiracies advocate, and say, oh well, maybe the government created this explanation just to cover up the aliens doing this, and
right. Yeah, I mean, and this is one of the problems with a landscape of secrecy, is that it actually throws a monkey wrench into the normal use of Occam's razor, right? Because anytime you have something in which a cover-up is an actual functional piece of the thing, what is a cover-up? Well, a cover-up is something that attempts to create the impression of the way some dots should be connected that isn't the correct way to connect them. And so anyway, again, this is why I have appreciated your work for many years, is that my own feeling is Occam's razor works even when you're dealing with conspiratorial stuff, but it only works when you have all of the information. When you have a subset, especially a curated subset of the information, you have to be ready to see a violation of Occam's razor and realize that, you're missing evidence. And so anyway, yeah, where's the cover-up?
It goes way beyond that, beyond Occam's razor, when you deal with a cover-up, because what you have is an institution which has control of 90% of the mainstream media, where they can direct a message, create a false movement, prop up their fake leaders of this false movement, lead an entire movement in the wrong direction. Because you go back to Thomas Pynchon's, to quote Thomas Pynchon in Gravity's Rainbow, if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. And that's the whole concept of the game here, is that they they prop up all these know-nothings with the misinformation so that they can put those front and center, create this movement, attitude that we're going to knock down the doors and get the answers to all this stuff. But they ask the wrong questions, and then it gets debunked, and then everyone loses hope and goes home and says, oh, maybe there's nothing to this. And then if there is programs there, they're not getting talked about, and they're also hyping everyone up about that it's aliens, and that we need to get the government to disclose the truth, to bring out the saucers and the aliens and to bring it up. But what if that's not the case? We don't have we have some interesting circumstantial evidence for that, but we don't have any direct evidence.